last video cut me off basically saying I don't have any time management skills at all, but that's okay. We're going to work through it. Come to find out that the other phone that I was using is going to have to put my videos into parts, which is not fun at all. I don't think you guys want like 12 different parts for this video. So I found another phone I'm going to be using, and it's going to give me 2 hours. I don't think it's going to be 2 hours, but it's going to be a while. This has turned into a hostage situation. So I'm going to start book over with passage 1. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to talk about it. So this may end up being part 2. This may not be. I may do 6, since I have to talk about 12 passages, so I may do 6 now, and then do 6 for like part 3. I don't really know. Let's just read passage 1 and see where it takes us, and go from there. So passage 1 can be found on page 33 and 34. Again, double entry. This is my double entry journal on To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm using the double print version. Only version my library had at the moment. We work with what we got. So the page numbers may be a little bit different if you have another one. Atticus said professional people were poor because the farmers were poor. As Macomb County was farm country, nickels and dimes are hard to come by with doctors and dentists and lawyers. Until it was only farmers going inspect stations. It was not until their mortgage to hilt, the little cash he made went to interest. If he had his math right, Mr. Cunningham could get a WPA job, but his land would go to ruin if he left it, and he was willing to go hungry, give his land, and vote as he pleased. Sir Cunningham, said Atticus, gave him set breed of men. So, why is this passage important? Why is this the first one that I pulled out? Again, there's so many that we can talk about, but especially because since the beginning of the book talks about the setting. But this is particularly important because it adds to the setting and helps us understand the time and place and even some of the things that divide the community. The poor people and then the rich people, the farmers and the doctors and dentists and lawyers. So this is very important, and the WPA, helps us understand the setting even more, because we know, if you know what WPA is, was a Great Depression, was something in the Great Depression helped with good jobs. So, I didn't do too much research on that, but if you continue reading, that's what we end up finding out if you're getting half the book. The other reason this is important is because this takes place in one of the first 2 chapters, and it helps us understand Scout's character better. So if we read a few pages before in To Kill a Mockingbird on that, for that first passage, if you read a few pages before it, we learn that this kid, this Cunningham kid, and I forget his name, that's really bad, but he can't bring his lunch to school, and it's because the Cunninghams are poor, and his dad doesn't want to get a WPA job, and as we know, during the Great Depression, it was hard to keep farms because of the Dust Bowl, and farming practices weren't good for them. And so, when we read those pages, we learn that Scout stands up for this Cunningham and tells the teacher that, well, he can't bring his lunch, and then he explains, and then she goes on to explain to readers why that is, thus getting us more attuned to the setting, helping us understand everything better, and even her character better. She stands up for people, and she fights for people, no matter who they are. So, some of these passages out of order, I just want to mention that first and foremost, because passage number 2 is on page 147 and 148. It's when Atticus says, I'd rather you shoot at tin cans in the backyard, but I know you go after birds. Shoot all the blue jays if you want. You won if you can hit them, but remember, it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. And then Miss Maudie then tells him, your father's right. Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat up people's gardens, don't nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. So why is passage number 2 important? I was going to try to find it here. I lost it. Anyway, why is passage number 2 on page 147, 148 in the Kill a Mockingbird so important? As because it mentions the mockingbird. The mockingbird is mentioned quite a few times in the story, and is mentioned 4 times, I believe. Plus, not including one time when they mention a songbird. So, it's important for that reason. It's a symbol, too, in the story. If you pay attention to the story and the setting and the characters, the mockingbird is a symbol. That's why it's mentioned so many times. And so here, Scout mentions that the mockingbird and the fact that it's innocent and harmless. And this discussion that she has with her father, then Miss Maudie, hints at the theme of good and evil. And one of the mockingbirds in the story is Tom Robinson, who's accused of raping a white woman, and I had in my notes here, Mayella Ewell, probably pronounced that name wrong. He's accused of raping this white woman, and then when he tries to escape, because eventually there's a trial, and they say he has raped her, he's been killed while trying to escape custody. And this passage is basically opening up and saying, it was not only is it a sin to kill a mockingbird, but it's a sin that there's so much racism and prejudice in our community, and that Tom Robinson was killed, which I think is pretty interesting. And I think that's why this book is so cool, is because Harper Lee does a good job of using the symbols to make it very clear to readers what's going on, even if you maybe don't understand the rest of the story. So, what is passage number 3? I love the mentions of the mockingbird. So, close to the very end of the story, on page 458, after almost being killed, but then being rescued by Arthur B. Radley, Scout says, well, it'd sort of be like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? And she says this because they basically are being chased, her and her brother Jim are being chased by Bob Ewell. And one of the officers that comes to assess the situation after Jim and Scout are rescued by Boo, which is what Arthur Radley is called in the story. After they are rescued, the officer knows that Boo killed Bob Ewell. Who, that name will sound familiar, because Bob Ewell is one of the main antagonists, I think it may be the word I'm looking for, but the main villain, if you will, in this story for Scout and Jim. He was Mayella Ewell's father, who, as we learned during the trial, is actually the one that hurt Mayella. Can't speak this morning. So the officer knows that Boo Radley killed Bob Ewell, but instead he says that Bob Ewell fell on his knife. Partially because Boo is so shy, but also just from what we've read in the story, they don't want to cause more tensions in the community. And so that is when Scout says, well, it's sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? And she's basically saying, and I wrote it down here, Scout then tells Atticus is saying otherwise, saying that Boo Radley did kill Bob would be a sin, just like killing the mockingbird. So, like I said, there's 4 mentions of the mockingbird, 3 or 4, but there's also mention of a songbird, and that is on page 398. When she talks about Mr. Underwood, this is after the trial, after Tom's death, Scout then says about Mr. Underwood, he likened Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. And Maycomb thought he was trying to write an editorial poetical enough to be reprinted in the Montgomery Advisor. So again, Scout does not mention the mockingbirds here, but she does mention the songbirds. Once again, saying that it was a sin that Tom Robinson was killed. And this is interesting because before mentioning Mr. Underwood's thoughts, Scout informs readers that most people in Maycomb considered Robinson's death typical. And that was on 397. But then on 398, again, large print version, she says that people were saying nigger always comes out in M. Femme, basically. A lot of old Southern language in here. So it's interesting that Mr. Underwood would basically be saying that Tom Robinson's death was senseless. It was a sin. And this is also interesting, and passage number 5 that I'm going to read kind of goes, I'll kind of go more into this. Don't want to spoil anything. But it's just interesting that Mr. Underwood would also be one of the people in the town that would say it's a sin. And it's interesting that Scout is picking up on this. And we're nearing the end of the story. That was on page 398. So we're nearing the end of the story. So we're clearly seeing the characters start to gain their traits, their main traits, and share them with peers. And we're also seeing, which is another one of the themes, the way Scout is going from a young woman to this girl, this young woman, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more soon. So passage number 5, and this is on page 398 and 399. It is right after Mr. Underwood says, likens Tom, when Scout, I can't see this one, when Scout talks about Mr. Underwood, Scout then says, "How could this be so? I wondered as I read Mr. Underwood's editorial. Senseless killing, Tom had given due process of law to David's death. He had been tried openly and convicted by 12 good men in trio. My father fought for him all the way. Then Mr. Underwood's meaning became clear. Atticus had used every tool available to free men to save Tom Robinson. But in the secret courts of men's hearts, Atticus had no case. Tom was a dead man the minute Male Ewell opened her mouth and screams." So again, after passage number 4, Scout wonders what Mr. Underwood meant. So then, after thinking it over, she begins to understand. He's basically saying it was a sin to kill Tom Robinson. But then, she also, and I'm just going to try to find it in here in the passage. Well, anyway, she also begins to understand Tom Robinson's trial, his death, his just everything that happens. Again, she's starting to become a young woman, starting to understand this. She's not fighting, which is something else we talk about. She's not fighting with her mouth in this moment. She's fighting with her head, which is very important to her character, and that's how she grows. But it's also very interesting. This passage is very interesting, at least to me, because not only does she start to understand all this, but she also says that Tom Robinson was basically a dead man as soon as Male Ewell accused him of raping her. And that, to me, is huge for Scout's character, because she's a kid, and we can clearly see, again, this theme of innocence being lost. So she's definitely starting to understand the sin in her community, or the racism and prejudice. So that was passage number 5. Let's move on to a treasure trove that I have like 2 or 3 different passages from, chapter 26. So passage number 6, ironic, right? But passage number 6 says, "Well, coming out of the courthouse that night, Miss Gates she was going down the steps in front of us. You must not have seen her. She was talking with Miss Devine Crawford." She goes on to say, "Jim, how can you hate Hitler so bad and then turn around and be ugly about folks right at home?" That was on page 408 and 409. So, this is after she realized what Mr. Underwood meant. So right after realizing what Mr. Underwood means, she goes to school. This is like the next chapter. We skip over to school. And she has this class called her current events period, where kids in her class bring in passages from newspapers to read. Kind of what I'm doing, but from newspapers. So current events, basically. And she witnesses something in this class that helps her see not only the racism and prejudice, but also the hypocrisy in her community, which is huge. Again, she's starting to fight with her head and think this all through. And in passage 6 particularly, this is when she is talking to her brother and is like, "Jim, how can you hate Hitler so bad and turn around and be ugly about folks right at home?" So what is it that happened? Maybe I shouldn't explain that. Well, for first thing, before going to school, and I thought this was important too, but I didn't close one of my passages, but I wrote it down to share with you. She tells readers, "I came to the conclusion that people were just peculiar. I withdrew from them and never thought about them until I was forced to." And it isn't until the current events period that she is forced to. And during the current events period, her new teacher, Miss Gates, talks about Adolf Hitler, because one of the kids brings in a passage about Adolf Hitler from a newspaper. And so Miss Gates talks about Adolf Hitler and how terrible it is, and it was, the Holocaust was horrible, but how terrible it was that he persecuted the Jews. And then, but as Scout points out, Miss Gates doesn't like Hitler. She hates him, she despises him, but she also despises the people within her community. And so as we read this passage, we see that Scout is starting to realize why this is so hypocritical. So before talking to Jim, Scout talks to her dad, and I thought this was so interesting. In case you don't know, I'm a World War II history buff. I've studied a lot about World War II. I think its parallels with today's history is so interesting and fascinating, and it's so important to know. So if you don't understand this passage, definitely go to the library and read some books about World War II. But before talking to Jim, she talks to her father, who then says, it's not okay to hate anybody. She's basically telling him, and this is on page 407, passage 7, 407, ironic. But he's basically telling her that you shouldn't hate anybody, even Hitler. And so while what Hitler did was atrocious, he's telling her that hate is powerful. Hate empowered Hitler, and it now is empowering the people in Macomb, which is where Scott and her family lives. And so, and on these pages, as we're nearing in the book, we're starting to see that Scout is understanding this and how powerful hate really is. So that's only the beginning of chapter 26. On passage 8, on page 405, which can be found in 405, this is when she's in her current events period, and one of the things she says, I raised my hand remembering an old campaign slogan Agassiz once told me about. Equal rights for all, special privileges for none, I quoted. So, part of the reason why I love this is because Harper Lee, who is the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, she calls out Macomb in more than one way. And in this instance, she has Scout say a very simple campaign slogan from that time period. And yet, readers who read that realize that she's calling out Macomb. So democracy, which is what Scout is basically talking about, which is what America is built on the idea that equal rights are for all and there's special privileges for none. But when we read To Kill a Mockingbird, we are seeing racism, prejudice, hypocrisy within Scout's community. And Harper Lee just beautifully calls him out on this, and just by using that campaign slogan. And then later, as we know, I just read them, but with my passions 6 and 7, but we learn that Miss Gates hates Hitler, but again, very hypocritical, like hates Hitler, but also hates people in our community. So hate is powerful. So that's enough dissecting that scene. Hopefully I didn't go too fast. I am looking at my time and trying to manage my time without going too fast. So let's move on to a lighter note. Let's stop talking about some of these darker themes. Let's move on to passage. I'm going to move on to passage 9, which can be found on page 28. So again, these are kind of out of order. So back to close to the beginning of the book. So Scout says, until I feared I would lose it, I would never love to read. One does not love breathing. So on her first day of school, Scout doesn't only get caroled out for helping the Cunningham boy, and which I don't think I mentioned, but she gets in trouble for basically telling her teacher that he's poor. Again, kind of pointing out that setting and some of those themes.